ActionSA leader Herman Mashaba is vowed to do away with the current broad-based black economic empowerment. Instead, the party is proposing an inclusive economic empowerment policy which will see business contribute 5% of profits annually to an opportunity fund. Let's speak about this. We're joined now by ActionSA Western Cape chairperson Angela Sobey, South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry President Mthokulu, and in the studio with me, South African Federation of Trade Union spokesperson Trevor Shako. Good evening to you, and thank you very much for joining us and coming on. Kapash, good to have you. And Angela, good evening, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. Let's start with you, Angela. Empowerment legislation. What are you finding the current empowerment legislation to be unable to do that you think the IEE, Inclusive Economic Empowerment, will be able to do?
Well, sorry, if I heard the question correctly, the current legislation as it stands, Black Economic Empowerment, has failed in empowering everybody that it was meant to empower equally, and instead has only served to enrich a few those politically connected. So as ActionSA, we are saying that we would like to see that replaced with something called inclusive economic empowerment, and ensure that there is a broader base of economic empowerment, and that does not just favor a few, but favors a broader base of South Africans and ensures that it brings about equity.
Yeah. So I like what you're saying in your statement. You're saying part of the challenge is we need to understand what is the problem that we are trying to solve, right? So if you are saying the empowerment legislation did not work, what was the problem that was being solved with both BEE and the broad-based black economic empowerment that you're saying this has failed to solve that problem? So
BEE was introduced to assist in uplifting, in economic upliftment of those that were previously disadvantaged in the previous dispensation. And we are saying that it has not achieved this. It has merely economically uplift a politically connected few, where the existing empowerment has led to a class of wealthy tenderpreneurs, and it has failed in improving the futures of communities in impoverished areas. What it has done is it's awarded tenders to connected companies and individuals, and it's mandated racial quotas in senior corporate roles, and this has not effectively increased the number of professionals that we adopted in, I think, around 2003 in South Africa. And according to the Gini coefficient, inequality has increased in the country. So South Africa continues to remain one of the most unequal societies globally, where we're sitting with unemployment at around 44%, which is one of the highest rates in the world. The legislation, which was intended to uplift the people, has actually the current, that is the status quo in terms of Black economic empowerment. Yeah. As ActionSA, we do acknowledge that many impoverished South Africans are those from previously marginalized communities, especially those marginalized by apartheid. But we do uphold non-racialism as one of our values. Yeah. And we firmly support a genuine, inclusive economic empowerment that benefits all historically disadvantaged communities. Yeah. Yeah. We're looking at promoting a vision where government action dismantles barriers rather than hoarding resources, and ensuring equality of opportunity for all.
I'm going to come back to that. We'll expand a little bit. We're having a bit of a challenge with your connection. I don't know if it will improve. We are hearing you, however, but it is a little bit hakarach, as they would like to say. Kabashi, let's bring you in here. BEE, or broad-based black economic empowerment included, has failed, one, to uplift the disadvantaged, two, to see an increasing significant number of professionals coming into the space, three, has not dealt with inequality. Would you say those are true observations of what BEE has been able and has not been able to do?
Good evening, Baumjuli, and to my fellow panelists. I think, well, look, as business, we respect all the political parties in this era as they are making their various commitments and their promises through their manifestos. But I think I will caution against the making of sweeping statements that BEE has failed. I think Angela doesn't actually categorize the importance of BEE and its background and what it has been able to achieve, and obviously with its own limitations. I think it will be unfair to say there is nobody of a historically disadvantaged background who doesn't sit in management now. There are a number of successful transactions that were facilitated by the policy. I think it is understandable, though, that it has not dealt with the concentration of wealth and economic activity. But to say it has failed and it has not empowered a new class of professionals and has not spread a bit of wealth will be incorrect, because there are transactions that were successful. However, we still have a structural problem of concentration of wealth, which still goes according to the patterns of the previously urbanized areas of our economy.
So, I mean, the argument is that forcing private companies to employ some black people in senior positions is not necessarily what's going to deal with poor education, poor resources in townships, poor health facilities, poor roads, and so on and so forth. Yes, you've got policies or laws that say companies hire some black people in senior position. All that has done was result in manipulation of equality outcomes. So the scorecard must look good, but in essence, what is happening on the ground has not translated.
Yeah, well, look, there's a lot of stats. I think I will repeat the point that to say it's wholly or a big failure is incorrect. If you look at the broader architecture of economic transformation, BEE sits in the middle. In the first generation of transactions, the emphasis was on ownership and management. But if you look at the current 7 pillars, it touches strategic procurement, supply development, socio-economic development, and affirmative action. So the pillars of BEE are actually beyond just the elite that everyone wants to talk about, the fact that an elite class has hijacked BEE. There's a number of projects that business has done through socio-economic development, through CSI budgets that are part and parcel of the BEE scorecard. And some people are not necessarily part of the ownership or the management, but they benefit from supply development and enterprise development. So there's a number of key pillars that we need to actually emphasize and review and build upon in the BEE legislation, which ultimately actually will take us to an inclusive economy. So it's not about discarding BEE to replace it with something else. I think inclusivity is what we are all working towards, and BEE is one of the key pillars that we hope will help us to bring the marginalized into the economy and ultimately broaden the size of this economy.
Trevor Shaku, let's bring you here, Voice of Labour. Equal opportunity is something that is a reality for you. It's something that you want for everybody. You want for all your members. You want them to benefit. You want them to get equal salaries. You want them to get equal opportunities. You want them to get a chance to own shares in these companies, and so on and so forth. Has the empowerment legislation in place created that new class of working class members?
Look, the empowerment legislation, because it is implemented in the context of a capitalist framework, will continuously produce inequalities. And it is actually baffling me that the spokespersons of capital, either they do not understand the logical contradictions that emerge out of capitalist mode of production, or they are just disingenuously shying away from realizing the facts, because the facts are here. One, the problem is not necessarily the question of BEE failing or this or that. It is because BEE is a redress policy that is introduced in the capitalist mode of production. But let's perhaps look at what inherently in the mode of production that we are in at the current moment is producing or reproducing inequalities. Firstly, we know that a lot of the inequalities in our economy are produced by at least two things. One, it is unemployment. Two, it is lower wages. And continuously, what we see businesses doing is that, especially at the current moment, we've seen a lot of businesses across the sectors of the economy embarking on retrenchment processes. Why are they embarking on retrenchment processes? It is because they want to reduce input costs so that they can maximize their profits. So that on its own is a logical contradiction of capitalism, that for the capitalist enterprise to be considered thriving, it would have to reproduce the low incomes, it would have to introduce machinery and retrench workers. So this is inherent in the system of capitalism, and the fact that ActionSA thinks that it will introduce inclusive economic empowerment, and through that you are going to see many people empowered, in my view, is just fallacy, and also shows that they are not learning from history.
So throwing in employee ownership schemes into that mix, you're saying, doesn't make any difference?
Indeed. In fact, thanks for this question, because we just came from one jamboree organized by the president on employee share schemes, ESOPs. Now, what is happening there is that they are giving you a picture that seeks to paint a transformatory type of a progress in the country, that the employee share ownership scheme has empowered this much workers. But I will tell you, Thabo, that such particular ESOPs are actually just tokenism that seeks to create an illusion in the hands and the eyes of workers that they are owning and they are part of this economy as part of the transformative, so-called transformative policies to transform and make the economy more inclusive. But that is not true. I mean, for instance, if you take, say, for instance, 10,000 workers of, let's say, RCL, and who are maybe owning 50,000 shares, and each and every year, or in 1 year where, let's say, RCL is paying dividends of 56 cents, what will they translate in to the workers, who, for instance, will be 10,000 having to share the 56 cents of the 100,000 shares or 50,000 shares they have in that particular company? It means nothing, and it will never be redistributive or distributive, and as a result will not even create the inclusive economy that they are speaking about. In fact, this talks about creating an inclusive economy is just to lull workers to sleep so that they can continue to rake in profits.
Angela, what do you make of that? One, your reading of BEE would be incorrect if you say it has done completely nothing. One, there's been various iterations. It's not just that ownership where you're saying, no, you're just creating wealthy entrepreneurs. There's been other levels. There are other pillars. There's procurement. There is supply chain development. There's CSI. There's a whole lot that needs to be considered than just to couch it in that it just creates the elite group or a new class of entrepreneurs and does nothing for the future of the poor.
Well, I think when all has been said and done, a few, it has not benefited the majority. The majority of South Africans live in squalor, in poverty, and have not benefited from all of this. So we can sit here and debate for as long as we want. It's not going to change the fact that you have individuals that happen to be politically connected, that have benefited, that have gone out and bought themselves the fanciest of cars and moved into the nicest of houses at the expense of the majority.
And how does coming up with an opportunity fund rapidly expand those opportunities to everybody?
So the idea with the Opportunity Fund is aimed at empowering communities through investments in infrastructure, education, and entrepreneurship. we're looking at reintroducing what we call a universal basic income stimulus to stimulate economic growth and job creation. As ActionSA, we recognize that without stimulating the economy and growing the economy, it requires other interventions such as tackling corruption decisively, establishing the rule of investment into this country in order for our economy to grow. When the economy grows, businesses can flourish, and businesses then, through the private sector and entrepreneurs, are able to create jobs. So by allocating funds towards education, entrepreneurial funding, infrastructure, and sustainability investments is some of what we seek to do through the Opportunity Fund. Also, the Opportunity Fund will be managed by independent professionals, limited, and ensures transparency and accountability, as well as the implementation of a time-bound tax on private sector profits, excluding SMMEs, to fund these initiatives.
All right. ActionSA Western Cape Chairperson Angela Sobey, South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry President Toxulu, and the South African Federation of Trade Union spokesperson Trevor Shaku with us in the studio. You're joining us on WhatsApp 072-110-554. Kabash, your members, I mean, how would they feel about making their 5% profit contribution towards an opportunity fund that will be independently managed by a fund manager who will be investing in key infrastructure and resources and ensuring that we create more jobs and get more people employed, as opposed to what you have with BEE, something called an empowerment fund, which of course helps those who want to get into some kind of transactions and so on and so forth to be able to be funded to do so.
Well, I think the ActionSA policy is still fairly premature at this stage, because if you read further, it effectively means that business through this fund is going to start building schools, building clinics, and so on, and over and above the current taxation that is supposed to finance the state to do exactly that. I think the irony with the proposal of bringing in a team of independent professionals is exactly one of the weaknesses of the current BEE, that what is meant to be proper CSI and enterprise development funds, for instance, end up being gobbled up by fees that are charged by consultants, because companies eventually hire consultants to identify beneficiaries, but those consultants eventually collect a fee. So not all the money gets to where it's intended. And also some of these consultants tend to spend the money amongst the same beneficiaries. So the idea should not be that you have a fund run by fund managers to do everything that the state is doing. Business will continue to pay its taxes, and we must allow businesses through their various instruments of CSI and enterprise development, which is either done through BEE or through their own corporate strategies, for them to impact their communities. As I mentioned earlier, businesses are doing what they're doing in their own localities. Our problem in the country is not that it's an elitist project. The problem is that it's the patterns of economic activity, that those who are far from the major centers are unlikely to benefit because they're not close to big business. What we need to talk about is how do we revive smaller towns to create economies closer to people, and not necessarily overhaul a policy like this, because it's probably one of the biggest economic policies in the country. We just need to manage it better.
So how do we do that? How do you get this universal access to be realized, as opposed to only those who are in urban areas being able to access these opportunities?
Look, I think we need to revive and look at the patterns of economic activity. I know we focus a lot on economic growth, but the biggest problem in this country is that small towns and cities that used to be thriving economies, say 30 years ago, have almost disappeared now, and everybody is moving to the three main centers. So what we need to do, we need to look at the strengths of each of these towns and look at how we revive economies at that level and be able to trade at that stage. We can also probably prescribe how we direct these CSI budgets. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Sometimes businesses, out of good faith, will say we'll support certain foundations, but they don't always follow through as to who are the ultimate beneficiaries. So it's not that the businesses are not committed to spending the money, it's how the transactions are designed. So I think we need to go back and say, what are the next 20 towns that we have some sort of a history of economic activity? How do we strengthen them? And the pools that we have from this BEE transactions or these CSI commitments, how do we make them flow to strengthen those small towns? So effectively, you need to have some level of decentralization of economic activity and make sure that in areas where there's a high concentration of wealth, for instance, around manufacturing and mining, we look at how we spread that wealth and expand the definition of a host community so that we also support those smaller towns that have a potential but may not necessarily have a big tax base or a big industrial base currently. But through effort, we can actually bring in more towns and build another Johannesburg, another Cape Town, and another Durban.
Right. Trevor, you've always, I mean, a number of times you've come here, called for a wealth tax, right? Would this not be some kind, maybe not a wealth tax, because at least business here are saying apparently they are willing to directly contribute themselves, this 5% into this opportunity fund, according to ActionSA. They say they've asked them, they consulted with them, the business is saying they're more than happy to do that. Is that something not similar to a wealth tax that is then taken and given to the poor and developing their businesses, taking others to school and so on and so forth?
Look, I think ActionSA consulted with their funders only. I don't think they consulted the rest of the capitalist class. If you go to the rest of the capitalist class, including the small, medium enterprises, they're not going to shed or rather part ways with the 5% of their profits, because they have to replant that into expansion of their own production. It is those that are already established, big corporations, that might actually be willing to give this 5%. But it is also laughable in my view, because these are the people who in any way try by all means to sabotage any redistributive and distributive tax measures that have been implemented. When we speak about the corporate tax being increased again, they are the first people to actually resist that. If anything, they've pressured government to reduce corporate income tax from as high as 52% in 1992 to today 27%. Now, you can't tell me that such people are going to be willing to part ways with their profits, 5% of their profits. It is not going to happen. Maybe a funder, one single funder who's funding ActionSA, is the one they consulted and said that, no, we can be able to avail a certain amount of money at 5% of our profits. But we also know that it is not even obligatory, because if you read that statement of theirs they released, you realize there that what they are saying is that they are going to ask business to give and contribute 5% of their profits. In other words, it is not obligatory, and as a result, those businesses will pull out as and when they wish. This is the first point. The second point which we must consider is that our call for the taxing of the rich, it is mainly for distributive purposes, because taxation really does many things. It is levied for various purposes. And for us, this purpose is not necessarily because we have illusions in the fact that government only depends on tax. In fact, we've all along demystified this idea that government depends on taxation to be able to meet its spending obligations. But we call for the wealth tax or the taxing of the rich, the 1% in particular, because we think that the economy is structured in such a way that it concentrates wealth in the tiny minority of the population, whilst the overwhelming majority of the population languish in poverty. And it is for that purpose that we're only calling for the redistributive taxation in the form of the wealth tax or the taxing of the rich of the 1%.
Yeah. Angela, why not just tax the 1%? This 5% that you're saying you will collect, just tax them 5%, make it obligatory, and use it for distributive purposes.
I think it's important to understand that for all intents and purposes in this discussion that we are having, we are sitting with a society that is far worse off than it was when this program was introduced. So for all that we are defending and trying to make it sound like, you know, this could be improved or that could be improved. The fact of the matter remains that, so what it does require is for us to take the issue of economic justice is a prerequisite for social justice. We have to proactively address the root causes of economic exclusion that resulted in the inequality, the poverty, and the unemployment amongst previously disadvantaged South Africans. They were already disadvantaged and are now even more disadvantaged. Doing this requires, it's going to take time. It's not going to be an overnight solution. However, we have to start somewhere. And in order for us to start somewhere, this is the approach that we are introducing as ActionSA. It's going to require funded programs led by ethical people in South Africa to ensure that we are able to remove the barriers that prevent people from participating in economic opportunities and accessing those economic opportunities. We do recognize that we are sitting in a very unequal society. And retaining the state initiative for men, and this is not ActionSA saying it, this is the lived experience of many South Africans, is not something that we can take forward. We have to introduce something that it acknowledges the inequality and seeks to redress and equalize society through equal economic participation. You know, these initiatives also need to ensure that we get out. It cannot take place through cosmetic top-down approaches. Sorry, it seems my network is unstable.
Yeah, okay, we can still hear you still, yeah?
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so we're saying that it cannot just be a top-down approach, that this is what needs to happen and the assumption. It needs to take place in a series of, it needs to be a comprehensive solution. That sees economic growth, that the inequalities are addressed.
Yeah. What reforms are you proposing to the employment equity measures, right? We currently have a Commission for Employment Equity that says businesses are not coming on board in terms of meeting those employment targets. So what are you suggesting in this IEE would be the reforms on the employment equity measures?
So we've got measures in place that we're looking at in terms of employment equity, but we've also got something called the Universal Basic Income Stimulus, which is an initiative that's designed to ensure that existing grants are maintained or expanded alongside the new UBIS or the Basic Income Stimulus by expanding tax-based incentives to encourage employment of historically disadvantaged individuals. We're looking at introducing workers. It's projected to create approximately 1.6 million jobs and increase economic growth by 2 percentage points over a period of 3 years. It's a 3-year program offering regular unconditional cash payments to boost consumer spending and economic activity. When it comes to employment equity, we'll reform the national minimum wage to make it more adaptive and supportive of young and inexperienced workers. Often, you know, the youth complains about the fact that they cannot find work because they're inexperienced. And how do we expect them to gain experience if they can't find jobs? So we're looking at introducing a tiered system. And under this system, wages will be scaled based on experience, starting at 1.5 times the upper bound poverty line for those with less than 2 years of work experience. We're also looking at introducing tax-based incentives for companies by allowing employers to claim of the wages paid to historically and disadvantaged employees. And this incentive will replace all racial quotas. We'll also provide wage subsidies for employers who participate in what we want to introduce as a national service year. and employ eligible young individuals so that inexperienced workers can be incorporated into the workforce more easily. And we want to ensure gender and racial equality is upheld in the workplace by enforcing penalties on companies found guilty of racism, sexism, and discrimination in the workplace. We're also wanting to address spatial spatial injustice through equitable property ownership opportunities, and also committing to sustainable land reform with existing legislative frameworks and avoiding constitutional amendments in that context.
Yeah. Kabasha, penalties for racism and sexism in the workplace. I mean, something that we have been discussing. It's something that the Commission has been discussing. They've been calling for more teeth. It doesn't seem, though, that companies are largely bothered by it. They pay the penalties and keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Any form of sanction needs to deter people from committing those acts. I think we all have to agree that maybe in some cases you may want to increase the bite of the law. But I think what I would like to also mention is that, I think ActionSA, and we will be willing to engage further, they should not actually try and pit their inclusive economic empowerment policy against existing legislation. They should actually bring it as part of enriching the experiences that South Africans have seen over the past few years, because there are a lot of similarities on things that they're bringing up. But I think they are going to cause a lot of problems if they want to pit it as if it's a replacement. Talking about employment equity, skills development, employment stimulus, all this is well and good, but there's a lot of pockets of existing law that just needs to be enriched. So I think we must talk more about how is this policy going to complement what we have and help us to strengthen the implementation and the impact of these policies. So I think the weakness that we've actually been having this whole hour is that we are trying to pit this policy against BEE. BEE, EE, and all the other empowerment policies are necessary for the country because they were informed by a problem statement. But obviously, with the experience that we have now lived, we need to be saying, how do we enhance the lived experience of South Africans? How do we close the gap? How do we make sure that the enforcement is strengthened? And obviously all the other elements that are being proposed. So we don't necessarily say that they are out of order with the inclusivity policy, but it should not be a replacement of what is working, because there are pockets of excellence. However, we need to pull together and make sure that as business, we are responsive to the human conditions of the South African economy.
Appreciate you all. All right, I'm going to get Trevor to respond when we come back from the break, and we'll wrap up our conversation. ActionSA Western Cape Chairperson Angela Sobey, South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry President Mtokulu, and the South African Federation of Trade Unions spokesperson Trevor Shaku. 072-110-5584. You can weigh in tonight. We're back in a moment. Right, back live with you tonight, PM in Focus. Let's wrap up the conversation then. Still with ActionSA, we have the South African Chamber of Commerce as well as SAFTU with us in the studio. Let's wrap it up, Trevor. I mean, when you hear the suggestion that there will be a universal a basic income stimulus of just 3 years, what immediately comes to your mind? But two, when you're speaking of reforms in terms of employment equity measures, they are talking, for example, dealing with the question of minimum wage and putting levels to it as to entry level. They might not need to be paying the minimum wage where it's sitting right now at that level, so as to give young people experience.
Sure. Let me start with the last question. Firstly, their proposition in their manifesto is that they are going to, and she of course repeated some of the points here, is that they are going to, they hate the minimum wage, but maybe because they want to be relevant, they are saying that the minimum wage will be reduced to the upper bound poverty line. Now, the upper bound poverty line determined by Stats SA and government is 1,550. In other words, they are going to move it from 4,680 to 1,550. Now, that is going to create problems for us. And if they are saying that the inclusive economic empowerment is about dismantling inequality, what they are actually proposing in their manifesto with the proposed changes to the national minimum wage is going to merely further and contradicts what they actually profess to be advocating for. That's one. But two, we've got to expose the theoretical and ideological underpinnings of their understanding of the national minimum wage and why they're opposed to it. The reason they're opposed to it is because they believe, like all market liberalists, that the market must be left to the whims of the market, supply and demand, and it will readjust and equilibrate. In other words, you have 11.6 billion in this country. You should allow them to go and contest for jobs without setting a floor of wages. But if you, for instance, have a high unemployment rate, as we do in this country, and you were to leave the labor market to be the one that determines the basic minimum wage floor, you are actually going to end up with a 0 rand or 1 rand for a person who must, because everybody will be willing to enter the market and accept whatever they can come out of that particular market with. In other words, it will be a continuous and a gradual diminution of the living standards of our people because the wages of workers would be drastically reduced as a result of having been left to the whims of the labor market. Now, this is problematic. It is just going to reaffirm the inequality that has developed as a result of capitalism. One element that I want to add to this is that what they are actually calling for is inclusivity in poverty. That's what they are calling for. Because if you are saying you are calling for inclusivity in the economy, but you are advocating for wages to be lower, you are actually saying people must earn as low as they should, as long as they're all included in that particular economy, which is an economy of poverty. We already have, according to the Peter Marisbeck Economic Justice Dignity Group, the Household Affordability Index that has shown that the household grocery of an average household in this country costs about 5,300. Now, if you were to gradually reduce the minimum wage to 1,500, you are going to be setting the more than 4 million people who are earning the minimum wage into poverty again, because it would mean they are not able to afford those things. The third element, which I think we've got to speak to, and which is affirmed, by the way, by the, whenever the Employment Equity Commission publishes new and brings new research and the minister approves and it is published into new adjustment and reviews, there is always an uproar from various communities, especially the racial communities we have in the country. Particularly if you would hear the colored community would be crying that, no, we are being excluded. Of course, that narrative is being driven by the racist conservative organization called Solidarity. What these communities are crying about is a reflection, actually, of the high unemployment rate and any employment equity, if we were to go by the targets of the Department of Labor, would mean that certain people have to share also in poverty. They have to share in unemployment. So it's unemployment equity in other sense, because it means that proportionally to the number of people you have as a race in the labor force, you have got to have a certain number of people employed in a certain industry, in a certain sector. And that on its own means that we've got to share in the country's unemployment. And that is the reason why many people are outraged. So what these people are doing here is nothing but to not recognize the root causes. She was speaking about the root causes of the problems that creates inequality, but they are not addressing them. If anything, they do not understand really what causes them. As I've said in the opening, they either do not understand the inherent inequality that is reproduced by capitalism, or they're just disingenuously misleading the South African population. Because after 30 years, we cannot sit here and think that those people in the ANC do not have good intentions. They do have good intentions. The problem here is the policy choices they take. The policy choices they take are market liberalists, unfortunate parties that you are going to subsequently and inevitably have the concentration of wealth in fewer hands. And because we have a racial legacy of capitalism, where the colonial class of bourgeoisie is the one that was dominant in the economy, continues to have that. And under capitalism, you are not going to have distributive and redress policies in employment in economy without having to go through the BEE laws. Yeah. But this is the very reason why we stepped in as the trade union federation to say, look, the BEE is a fitted measure to reform ownership in the economy, but it is only going to redistribute the economic or the share of the national income to a fewer group of black people, or the so-called previously disadvantaged. But it is not going to distribute that wealth across society, across each and every one of the working people who are toiling every day, or who are sitting at home, who cannot find employment because the economy is not creating employment. If anything, we've seen that with automation, digitalization, the gradual development of this economy is inevitably leading towards greater retrenchments of our people. And that merely spells doom for many working class people who resort to crime to be able to make end meet. And whatever they may propose, and I say this in absolute terms, whatever they may propose as distributive and redress policy measures in the economy, are not going to deal with inequality. It is just going to add sprinkles of black, colored, and Indian ownership in the economy, but it is not going to go any far in terms of distributing wealth and dealing with inequality and poverty, and of course the socio-economic crisis that arise out of that particular base.
Let's leave it there. Much appreciated. Abash, thank you very much for coming on. Angela, thank you very much. And Trevor Shaku.